G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic week. Now today, as always, we do have a lot to go over and a lot that we need to add nuance to talk about because things are so complex and I do think there is an oversimplification of so many aspects around this. So this video will be longer, but I enjoy the research and I feel that I need to add these certain nuances and elements of information and I know that extends the video. I do apologize, but it may also be the final video for at least a couple of days. I do tomorrow have a functional MRI and I need to travel just into the city for that, but it's going to take a few hours. As you know, I had the MRI on my brain tumour about 2 weeks ago. News wasn't fantastic, so we've got to do some further testing and that will take some time. But today, we do have a lot to look over. So we're going to look at some strikes, some weapon systems, some geolocations. Remember with strikes, I'm not showing you something just because it's like, whoa, I'm showing you something because I believe it is strategically important. So if I don't show something someone else does, we'll go and watch it there. Then we're going to look at maps, geolocations mixed in with that. And what we're going to do is then overlay where the fortification defensive lines are, as that is very crucial to look at the maps as well. Then we're going to get a full frontline situation breakdown between fortifications, manpower, situations on different areas in the front line, as well as looking at maybe some historical references of war, tactics, doctrine, strategy as well. And of course, we know that Zelensky is in the US to present his victory plan based off the 10-point peace plan. And we're going to look at that as well as security guarantees around this as well and what this holds in the future of war, future of Ukraine v. Russia. So, a lot to go over. So, let's start at these strikes. Now, some high quality imaging has come out of the 3 major ammo depots that have then been struck by Ukrainian drones in the past week. So, you can see just from this first image. Now, I'm not going to show you all the images here. They're all on my Telegram. You can go and have a look, and they're bloody everywhere at the moment. But you can have a zoom in and have a look around. So you can see just the size of the crater here and the explosion that has been caused from the high explosive ordnance here as well. You can see all the trees stripped bare laying over. Now, an important factor to look at is it's right along this rail line through here as well, linking up these ammo sections. And then it falls in line with other images and zoom ins on spots of what fighter bomber said, that these strikes are hitting when there's loading and unloading of rail with these munitions. And we can see a strike on this rail cars here and explosions, and then further upon a rail here as well. So there is a weak point there, and it will be interesting to see how and if Russia can change their operating procedures around the handling of these munitions to stop that happening. But I did have someone point out to me this, and I thought this was interesting. So at these facilities, there's 2 main storages: hard storage, soft storage. So your soft storage is more what we see in these then berms of soil, ammo in the middle, maybe some cover on the top to keep it out of the sun, to keep it out of the weather. Soft storage, and then you have your hard storage, which is a concrete bunker layered in earth and then fully reinforced as well, and further distance between these two. And what he pointed out is your soft storage is more your here, not for that long to the front line, but it's not going to be typically, it's not going to be your super critical munitions, where your more important stuff is going to be held in hard storage. And what was pointed out is there's absolute devastation to a lot of the soft storage, but a lot of the hard storage here doesn't have that much damage to it. Definitely not destroyed, as this whole thing would be bloody exploded. So that is a very interesting part to look at as well as some of these areas that may be under the earth too. So we don't exactly know how much in there. I know there's massive claims around all this. As I will always say, yes, these are important strikes. These are very important areas, and it is very embarrassing to Russia of what has happened there. To get an idea on how important this is, we're going to know. Give it 2, 3, 4 weeks. We'll see the ammunition situation for Russia on the front line. That will give us a clear indication of how significant these strikes are. Time marches on. We're going to know either way. Now, I get into bits of strikes I show or tactics that I believe are strategically important, not just showing it for the hurrah sake. So the first one I look at is this. And this was the caption that went along with it. Interesting footage, the use of an FPV kamikaze aircraft type Molnoya on a Ukrainian tank, so a Russian drone. The footage is interesting primarily because the drone has an automatic target acquisition system. So we do know logically where drones are going to go is some version of machine learning AI bloody free range drones out there. I'm glad I'm out of the infantry. But what we can see here is this red box comes up. It acquires then the Ukrainian tank here, and then we switch to another drone, and we see it then on target. Now, what I should say is, one, this could be added in post, although with the quality here, I don't believe it is. Now, is this just picking up the target and it's just merely on it and you steer it in, or is it steering itself? Those things we don't know, but we are going to see more and more of this into the future. You'd buy a $600 DJI drone secondhand. You can draw a box around your car and it will follow your car. This is going to go into these systems and it's going to be incredibly deadly. Now, this is another piece of footage I think is very important as well. And a Iskander M and Smerch multiple launch rocket strike on an M142 HIMARS position in a forest plantation near this village in Donetsk. So let's watch this as there is an important factor in here. Now, HIMARS, it is so hard to know how many have been destroyed. Now, in the last, say, month and a half since Kursk, we have seen many videos claiming to be destroyed. Some show that are destroyed, but we also know because they're a high-end target and Russia's using very expensive munitions against these, there's a lot of decoys out there too. So one side will say very few have been hit. One side will say heaps. Again, difficult to know. This one, unless it's that good of a decoy that it's driving around, well, then it is a real one because we see it driving into the trees down in here. But that's not the interesting part, nor is the HIMARS being interesting in here. What is interesting to me is we see then an Iskander strike here, massive bang, but then is what comes next. So you can assume there's probably maybe a command position in here or other then positions manned in this tree line too. And then we see subsequently 5 Smerch rockets, then target. So we see 3. You'll see one at the top of your screen, I believe. And then right, so in the middle, top and then bottom. And there's another one down the bottom here, just at the end, that then fall around here. Now, what this can be is you've had that main strike, people move away from that explosion. If something goes bang, it's always a good idea to move away from it. And then this following up double tap to hit those targets. What we have seen significantly this year is Russia's kill chain has increased dramatically from a drone seeing a target to getting a munition on that. We saw that first, I believe, with those helicopters getting hit was the first real example of that increase. And now we're seeing not only drones working with the Iskander, but also working with the Smerch in tandem too. What we do know is the Iskanders have been moved across into more artillery units. So the artillery guys who have the rocket artillery, such as the Smerch or gun artillery as well, also have Iskander on call. And that has seemingly made a big difference. And now we're seeing it used in conjunction. I believe that is important. So let's have a quick look at maps. Then we will talk then about maybe the overall frontline situation. That bit took a lot longer than I was hoping. Now, we don't have that many updates, but Surika said Russian army entered the first houses of Vuhledar, and I'm not talking about the dashes. So he is saying, really, that they are entering properly into Vuhledar itself. Now, Deep State has not updated. No, Surak map has not updated, but we do have a couple of interesting geolocations to look at here too. Now, I can't show this footage I put in the Telegram, but Russian soldiers here getting targeted. But what is interesting about this is then the geolocation. We have Mykolaiivka here, and then we'll bring up, let's have a zoom in. So we see this reservoir, that it's right up in here, right on the border of where is shown red in here. But this is a very important area to show how close to the first areas of Minigrad, Pokrovsk that this actually is. So let's really rough this out. You're talking a couple of kilometers under, say, 8 to Minigrad and getting closer to Pokrovsk as well, of where those forces are working and what is actually occurring down in these areas. Now, we do have further here of Noel reports. He has updated his map to show, well, we know the Russian soldiers are at least up in here somewhere, but he's shown some advancement today in that area. Now, what I told you was we're going to look at where fortifications are. Remember, we're going to talk about fortifications just in a little bit. Let's look at this front because I believe this is the most burning. So we'll line up Novhorivka, Seladove, Ukransk, and the train line through here as well. So just keep those few pieces in mind. So this map is not updated to the point of other maps. Regardless, let's have a look. This is where the train line is. These are the defensive works, as you can straight see right now. A lot of these fortifications have definitely, by Ukraine's own map, have come then under control. Look at Ukransk. We took a look at Ukransk. The closeness to then the train line here, these areas have likely come under control. Beyond this, there are not that many defensive lines. As well, Mykolaiv out towards these fronts, the amount of defensive and fortifications then beyond this really does thin out. You can see the amount gone through in here. Again, this will become more and more relevant as this war continues. This may actually then speed up. Now, we're going to talk about losses, tactics, all of this. Now, the UK MOD has put out this. Poorly trained Russian soldiers are being used as cannon fodder. And Russian daily average losses and have had a massive spike in here over 2024. This is what they're showing. Now, again, what numbers are you working off in this? Because the only one I see with any sort of reliable numbers is Mediazone. And they show quite the opposite. They actually show, over these months, a slip of the amount of losses here as well. So this is a very interesting part we see on this. This is showing actually quite the opposite. Although if you were to overlay this with the amount of ground received, it would be the opposite. So this is a very interesting piece. And what people point at is they go, how can the side with a 10-to-1 manpower advantage, an 8-to-1 to 12-to-1, depending on advantage in artillery, where artillery is the main weapon system causing casualties, how can then you be at a less than half casualty rate? Interesting. That's why we'll never actually know where those numbers are coming from. Now, I asked about Kursk. I was asked about, is Kursk a net positive, a net negative for Ukraine? And we can see the trend down in the net positive and net negatives and the number of votes, but it has really flattened out around here. Of course, the majority believing a net negative. I ask these on the Telegram every couple of days. But let's look at what Financial Times has spoken about protracted war, line this up with a few things we have spoken about, and then we'll look over what Surak has said about larger war. Russian offensive gained steam in August as Ukraine diverted thousands of its most battle-hardened troops to carry out a surprise incursion into Russia's Kursk region. Ukraine had hoped its audacious operation would force the Kremlin to redeploy resources from Donetsk, but that has not happened. Instead, Russian forces captured several towns, moving within 8 kilometers of Pokrovsk, 4 kilometers of Minograd, and unleashing the might of the Russian army both on logistical hubs in an attempt to take them before the end of the year. Some commanders and many soldiers see this as the cost of the Kursk offensive and a poor trade-off. Kursk was a good idea. It exposed Russia as being weaker than many people believed, but we're paying the price of it, more of our own land. So they're paying the price here because, like they're saying, thousands moved away to do that, and the bait was not taken by Russia to redeploy all its forces from these hot areas that was put out. Russia's main strategy has remained the same since the start of its full-scale invasion in 2022, overpowering Ukrainian forces with sheer might and resource advantages. Phoenix and commanders from 4 other Ukrainian brigades told the Financial Times this month, and they all complained their soldiers were sometimes outnumbered at a ratio of 1 to 8, and that for every shell fire, the Russians were firing 10 or more. This is what I talk about with these shell differences and casualty counts as well, where people throw, how is this then lining up? Now, someone has also said, I can't remember who was this in the comments, was saying, this is a war of attrition. It's not what is left, but who is left at this grinding operation moving forwards. But the Russian forces have also adapted. Their commander said, learning from earlier mistakes and avoiding large assaults with tanks and armoured vehicles. Their new tactics have led to recent successes in Ukraine's Donetsk region, forcing Ukrainian troops to retreat and bringing Moscow closer to its goal of controlling the entire area. Now, Sir Little Hart has said, strategists should think in terms of paralysing, not killing. And this is the manoeuvre warfare versus attritional warfare. What we don't know, because this is the first war we've seen with drones, all the armour, so you've got older weapon systems, brand new systems like drones and ISR. How viable now are large armoured assaults where it will be seen and it will be picked off and targeted? paralysing and outmanoeuvring rather than just grinding forward that he speaks about. Of course, the cost to man and machine is less to manoeuvre rather than to grind forward. Mikhail Tempa, a battery commander of the 21st Battalion of Ukraine's separate presidential brigade, who has been in the region since April, said that Russian tactics shifted in midsummer. They're now employing faster, more mobile units and have adopted strategies previously used by Wagner, the paramilitary group led by late Russian warlord Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was killed. Now, a friend on the ground, he has said that this has been taking place for some time, and I've shown you this before. VDV, and he did also say in Wagner in this too, are led by Spetsnaz. They're in small teams using hit-and-run tactics along their entire joint fires capability, and it's working well, and they're gaining ground fast. Small, hard, fast teams in and out, something the Ukrainians should be doing, and that's what I would do. So lining up more so with what we are saying as well. Again, I do think that Russia in some ways has forgone these large armoured manoeuvre assaults to a degree, and sort of those guys on motorbikes, the guys in the small buggy things, to move into an area incredibly dangerous, but to use as a bit of a hinge point for then basically just an armoured convoy that they know is going to take losses, and just that massive acceptance of losses, attritional push through. And it's hard to use historical examples and say good or bad doctrine, strategy, tactics, because we don't have another war where we have seen drones be used both in ISR and targeting capability as much as this. So these armoured assaults, is this realistic anymore of these like large manoeuvre warfare elements to paralyse and dislocate the enemy? Putin destroyed Wagner, but he took the most effective parts of it. Remember, we spoke about this. The losses in Wagner is hard to look at as overall, because there's a lot of conscripts in there who lost their lives as well, who were thrown into battle. We need to look at the existing higher end units of this. They learn lessons and experience from Wagner and are fighting like them. And in many areas, we believe fighting with them as well up in Kursk. This drone operator in Tempa's battalion said the new Russian tactic of using smaller infantry units to attack from several directions at once made it harder for him to target the troops. Maneuver has the allure of being very cost effective in terms of man and machine. Again, paralyze, dislocate the enemy. But is it even possible anymore with drones in these large maneuver armoured elements I'm meaning, not in small hit and run motorbikes, this and that? At the same time, Ukrainians could do little about Russian attack helicopters and jets carrying glide bombs. We have no air defence here. This is the deputy commander of 72nd Mech fighting 70 k's south of Pokrovsk in Vuhledar, we've shown you. The attempt to take Vuhledar has been costly for Moscow's forces, with thousands of troops killed and hundreds of tanks and armoured vehicles destroyed in nearly 2 years of battle. The taking of Vuhledar will be huge. The amount of cost that Russia has suffered over the past years trying to take Vuhledar has been immense. But with his own troops exhausted, the deputy commander said the Russians could stand a better chance at taking it in the coming weeks. We have had 0 rotations since the full-scale invasion begun in 2022. Typically, that would happen every 1 to 2 months. We need a break. Delays in Western arms deliveries are also a factor in the worsening situation for Ukrainian forces. But the commanders laid blame with Kyiv's military leadership for moving too slowly to build defensive lines and then constructing ineffective trenches and firing positions. I've shared with you before, I had a phone call with a soldier who was saying, positions, you need positions that people are willing to defend. And in this, that he sees defensive positions are the butterfly effect for everything outward from this. And he says if you've got good defensive positions, you then use less ammo. So you don't need as much delivery. You lose less guys. You don't need as much conscription or volunteers. And he said you can just look into any factor, and at all he believes the pinpoint of that was defensive positions, fortifications. Where are our fortifications? There were no real defensive lines. In February, when the Russians first managed to break through, taking the town of Avdiivka, what had been built since was inadequate, in open fields, far from tree lines, and sometimes behind hilltops, which makes it hard to spot the enemy. It's bullshit. We can't get infantry to trenches without any cover. The troops rely on shrubbery, which hardly conceals their movements, leading to senseless deaths. I shared this with you a week ago. New trench lines being dug on the outskirts, but they're being dug by civilians. This is in the east at the moment. Well built, I'll give them that, but not tactically sound. No interlocking arcs or facing the line of assault. 21st Separate Special Purpose Battalion of the National Guard have done a damn good job at the front smashing the advance of the Russians, but no support. Everything seems to be happening autonomously, not as a division. So problems with the defensive works right here and now. Now, why may this be happening? Well, we look onto this, another thing that I said. The Ministry of Defence signs a contract with a private company to build some fortifications, and then the company fully intends to do it without stealing anything. So the boss takes the money, starts giving instructions to the building crews, who basically respond, mate, you're paying us for a standard construction worker's wage. For that kind of money, we'll happily build housing in Kyiv or something. But digging trenches under a rain of fabs and Iskanders? No, thanks. And this is disregarding if that corruption were to just not exist. And we know that definitely does. We saw that in Kharkiv. We've seen this in other areas. But also that these guys are construction workers, contractors, and they're now expected to build these in a bloody somewhere that can be directly struck by drones or bloody fabs. You can see why this has such an effect on the front. We see many cauldrons are forming. Referred to the pockets of Ukrainian troops, the process of being encircled and cut off. Again, deep state map, you can see several of them at the moment. We have had a lot of losses. There are more losses than before. While declining to provide casualty numbers, he described his unit as in shambles, with wounded soldiers sent to hospitals and psychiatric wards, while fit ones have been redeployed to different units. Yuri also described Russian chemical weapons attacks on his troops, including one in April. Soldiers jumped out of their trenches to breathe fresh air only to be shot, talking about chlorpyrifrin. Now, chlorpyrifrin is used as a riot control agent. There are many videos showing both Russian and Ukrainian drones dropping chlorpyrifrin grenades. Even videos, helmet cam footage getting put out now by both sides of people putting chlorpyrifrin grenades in backpacks. That is outlawed under the CWC. But what this is used for, the Chemical Weapons Convention, what this is used for is if you've got a trench line and it goes under somewhere, you drop in that gas, it's bloody hits you like a ton of bricks. You run out trying to get some fresh air, and then a lethal drone, or you get then shot from that as well. We're seeing that used. It'd be very interesting to see what actually becomes of that with the seemingly systemic use by operators on both sides. While Ukrainian casualties were climbing, Yuri said Russians were higher. But despite hundreds of Moscow soldiers dying every day, they were quickly replaced by recruits. It is unimaginable. How long can they keep this up? The head of the drone reconnaissance units feared the answer could be several years and predicted the total destruction and likely occupation of Pokrovsk within 2 to 3 months. Realistically, Pokrovsk will be like Bakhmut. Now, let's talk a little bit more on this, and we'll talk about protracted war, some elements in this as well, and how Russia is fighting. We've spoken about that maneuver warfare, the changing of tactics and elements, and where the future of warfare may sit. Now, protracted and attritional wars, although highly likely, they are not mutually exclusive. My opinion on this war is it is both protracted and it is attritional. Protracted conflicts are extended cycles of action, counteraction, and experimental learning. As a result, the ability of a belligerent to adapt rapidly and decisively, whether in terms of training, tactics, or overarching military strategy, is critical. Indeed, one should not necessarily assume that a competitor with little experience in one aspect of warfare is incapable, under the galvanizing pressures of combat, of rapidly overcoming its earlier deficiencies. I think there was a degree of complacency put forth onto the Russians that they couldn't adapt, that they're out of this, out of that. Next thing, we've seen the adaptation of drones, other weapon systems, even down to what I showed you of the use of those missile systems in line with the drones. I think there was a complacency put around here, and we have seen that adapt and change far faster than many would have liked to see it, and far faster than many would like to still admit. During the Second World War, Hitler clearly underestimated the Soviet Union's ability to recover, whether in terms of industrial capacity or manpower. Now, I know that Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's nowhere near the power of that. But I do believe that we did underestimate Russia's industrial capacity and manpower when we look at losses, the sanctions. Speaking more about the Soviet Union, the People's Commissariat of Defense displayed its customary brutal efficiency by mobilizing truly staggering levels of manpower to replace its grievous losses, drafting older reserves, convicts, women, ethnic minorities, non-Russians from liberated territories. We're seeing that happen in occupied territories. And this is what I'd like to say here. Every time I'm asked to speak at an event, I say, do not calculate how paralysing these losses are by using our forces as the variable. Because 1,000 a day would cripple us in 1 or 2 days, we cannot assume that this is true of other states. Some of these states are willing to do what we are not, given some of this, to replace and mobilise that manpower and the efficiency, the brutal efficiency that this can cause. I've spoken at many lengths about if the Australian Army lost 1,000 a day, day on day, a couple of days, we'd be ineffective. So we can't use, well, they will crumble at this in X minute. We can't just do that. But not only population-wise, as far as X guys, lose X guys, inefficient, but as far as culturally as well. And there's decisions being made. Von Clausewitz, in his On War, speaks about a protracted great power war is above all an extended clash of national wills and the preservation of military and civilian morale, even in the face of severe loss and deprivation. This must be at the heart of any viable theory of victory. So what is the national will? Where does the national morale sit? Now, speaking of Russia, and I speak about, then we can't just add because that happened there and this would have our effect on us, therefore they're going to have the same effect. We cannot do that. The Churchill defined Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And I've spent a hell of a lot of time just trying to understand how Putin, how the Russian officials, how the culture may be just seeing this war overall to try and get an idea of what happens in the future of collapses or overthrow or this or that, where many have seen, oh, there's going to be an overthrow. We heard that messaging 2.5 years ago. And this still rings true today about Russia. I often think myself and others have a very Western outlook, but we put onto the whole world as far as politics and military. And this does skew the way that we interpret Russia or other areas around the world in both military and political decisions that have been made. And this even goes into terms of the willingness of the state to suffer incredible losses and absorb those losses, as well as how the state looks and the optics from the rest of the world upon that state. So I've got one more piece for you, and this is from Suryak, speaking about where he sees the future. This, with the onset of autumn and the arrival of rain and later snow, it will slow down the military actions on both sides along the Ukrainian front. However, with the conflict in Ukraine approaching 1,000 days, the situation is very different from the one we had in autumn of 22. The Ukrainian army does not stop retreating gradually along the entire broad front. The Kursk operation failed to achieve its final objectives, and although the Ukrainian forces still remain on Russian territory, their situation is seriously threatened by the Russian army begun to recapture the border territories and bring supply lines under fire control. Winter will make this even worse. Moreover, the failure in the north has allowed the Russian forces to make significant advances in August, highlighting the difficulty of the Ukrainians to plug all the microbursts on the front. And during autumn of 24, we will certainly witness the development, if not the outcome, of the battles for 3 important strongholds. When we're talking about attritional protracted war, you want to launch limited offensives along a broad front, but to keep your enemy on the back foot, plugging holes here and here and here until you start to have a breakthrough somewhere else. It affects psychologically on morale and also stretches the logistics of getting soldiers and equipment into areas. Now, these are the 3 areas that Suryak speaks of. First is Toretsk. The city of Toretsk is, together with Avdiivka and Chasiv Yar, one of the main urban battles of this year. Here, the control of the Dedekon will decide the duration of battle and will allow the move front towards Konstantinivka and begin advance towards Kramatorsk the following year. The outcome of the Battle of Chasiv Yar, which will not take place until 2025, must be awaited. So he's saying Chasiv Yar, so we're talking down in here, Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, breakthroughs, of course, out to Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk, will be later on, it'll be into next year, Pokrovsk. The city has lost its logistic value due to the proximity of the Russian positions. The city is not expected to fall into Russian hands this year either. Although those soldiers we looked at in the Financial Times, they were saying that it likely would. But the capture of the surrounding towns is expected to start the assault in early 2025. But the start of the battle from Nikolaev by late autumn is not ruled out. Number 3, Kursk, so just to the south of here. This important logistical base has displaced Pokrovsk in its initial objective that the Russians had. During autumn 24, we will see the end of the front west of the city of Donetsk and the elimination of the Vuhledar axis, moving the front 25 to 30 kilometers away from the front lines. The fall of Kursk will leave only Velnika Novostilka as the last major town in southern Donetsk. So we're looking down in here, of course, then we have Kursk down in this front as well. We see where Vuhledar is. We see then Khodorkovy and Velika Novosilka in here, of where Surak was saying that Russia was having advances only yesterday in this direction as well. To conclude this text, I would like to remind you that the war of attrition can continue in 25 and the Russian-Ukrainian war will sadly continue to claim thousands of lives. I think one of the main aspects we're not looking at too, at maybe a tactical level, is these glide fabs. I think this is somewhat being ignored slightly. There's one of a few game-changing weapons in this war. You guys know that I hate the word game-changing, but there are a few game-changing weapons. FPV drones. Drones used for ISR, but there's cheap commercial drones. Both those sort of go hand in hand. Ukraine's seaborne drones. Russian Lancet, which goes in with the drones, but it's not a commercially drone. But the fifth one on that list, for me, are cheap glide munitions. Now, we saw these present in 2023. We didn't see them used anywhere near as efficiently or en masse as we have seen this year, working in line, in tandem with frontline elements. Now, what fabs are best for is targets not moving. Now, what I say is, well, this is exactly what the situation is going to become in winter. Things slow down, things stop moving. It's also easier to see things under thermal or tracks in the winter. That I think the devastation we're seeing of fabs now, I think in winter we could see that increase a lot due to it slowing down fortifications and those fabs being to have a huge effect. But will Russia actually be able to make use of these effect if they can't then grind forward as far as territorial gains, or is that not going to be the plan at all, that they just want to continue attriting down and potentially could it then fall into their favour? So let's look at the peace plan and talk about some realities of this, and then we'll talk over like the full frontline situation. I'll try and add one of those little things so you can skip forward to that if that's what you're interested in. But of course, Zelensky's in the US. Now, one of the big things we think may come of this is long-range strikes or more Western weapons used back inside of Russia, but there's seeming to be no real budge on this. So, spokesman for the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has said on the Storm Shadow, when it comes to that, our position remains unchanged. So, they're saying that this is more about strategy here and broader discussions rather than that specific, but remains unchanged. We really did think that Storm Shadow was going to come through. I still think it will, but it will be interesting to see if it does or doesn't. And we can see that Germany has said very similarly, that Olaf Scholz has said Germany will not lift any restrictions. This does not depend on my personal attitude. We will not do that. And we have good reasons for that. So they're saying we're not going to be allowed to use Germany's weapons inside of Russia. Of course, the big one that everyone has wanted, given to Ukraine wants, is of course the German Taurus system. So no real budge on this. But one of the big things we get is what's going to be in this victory plan, and we don't really know yet. But the victory plan, we're getting more of a clear idea, is a stepping stone for the implementation of Zelensky's 10-point peace formula, which we have spoken about at this point in time is very, very far away given the military scenario currently on the ground. In my opinion, still very unlikely, and I'll go through the reasons for this. But we get things like this: the implementation of the peace formula preparations at the Second Peace Summit, special attention paid to the implementation of the peace formula, and shared plans of the Second Peace Summit. Remember that Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and many people within that have said that they will not be attending that Second Peace Summit. For the Second Peace Summit, this is Zelensky's speech here, moving forward with partners step by step according to the peace formula. So we know, again, this peace formula here. And we're working on food security, energy security, and holding Russia accountable for its terror. Next, we will address all the other points of the peace formula, including the release of prisoners and restoration of territorial integrity. So here to present then the victory plan. We know that victory plan Zelensky sees as a stepping stone to the implementation fully of the 10-point peace plan. But let's speak about this. Now, this was unveiled in November 2022. What I will say was November 22, end of 22, is when Ukraine last had the real initiative on the battlefield. Kherson, Kharkiv. November 22 was a very different war. Russia was on the ropes at that time. Other military analysts said at the time, this is the high point for Ukraine. This is where things should happen. So again, we're going back now a long way. We're almost going back 2 years. But we'll have a look over this and we'll talk about the reality of it. So, of course, the main points in here: nuclear, food, energy, security, release of all prisoners. I think everyone is really on board with this. But the restoration of the Russian-Ukraine border back prior to 2014, so that 1991 that we talk about again and again, that is where Ukraine see that. There's no giving up of any amounts of territory, a full withdrawal of Russian military forces, persecution of war crimes in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So handover, not only senior officials or other soldiers, but a handover and a special tribunal for Russian President Vladimir Putin as well. This isn't just going to happen due to meetings in the US somewhere. Assessment of ecological damage, guarantees against future Russian aggression, and multilateral peace conference with legally binding international treaties, such as things like NATO. I do ask, though, that will these ecological damage, crimes, things like this, will this extend out to things like then Nord Stream, or through to clear war crimes we've seen conducted through not only the Ottawa Treaty, through laws of armed conflict, through halls to combat, through the use of the Chemical Weapons Convention as well, to, regardless of where the soldier's from, the clear videos that are well outside and committing a crime there. Will that just be blanket over everyone or not? We will see with this. But guarantees of future Russian aggression, these guarantees. Now, what I believe Ukraine's really wanting here, personally, is I think Ukraine's really looking for just security guarantees of what moves into the future, and then we may see actual more discussions. Once those security guarantees are in place, we'll then see discussions about an end to the war. Now, you know as well as I, Tatari Gummy, he's incredibly switched on. I share him all the time. I think people should read and really listen to what he's saying more and more. President Zelensky is seeking security guarantees as part of Ukraine's ongoing effort to join NATO. While few expect this result to result in a positive answer, that reality is that Ukraine urgently needs security assurances to end the war to ensure its survival. This isn't mere rhetoric to grab your attention. It's an invitation to an honest discussion about why Zelensky is pushing for a new security framework and why it must be taken seriously. Now, realistically, my opinion, is Ukraine going to get a serious invitation to NATO at this? No. Could there be other guarantees of, okay, if the guns fall silent, we will look after you here, we'll give you this, we'll give you that? That is definitely a possibility as well. But it will be interesting to see how that then affects negotiations too. This is the impossible diplomacy of this war is insane. Anyway, some of these points may echo earlier discussions, but they need to be repeated to understand the full picture. No matter how optimistic some portray the situation or talk about great Ukraine after the victory, it doesn't resolve the problem. Admitting the problem and discussing it is the first step to a solution. There's just so much optimism sometimes you actually don't see the reality of what's happening or what could happen. Let's take a hard look at the potential consequences if Ukraine freezes the conflict without securing firm guarantees. First, consider the economic and demographic problems of post-war Ukraine. The country has lost 18% around that of its territory, including important agricultural and industrial regions in the south and east, even in areas under Ukrainian control near the front line. Land remains unsafe due to extensive minefields. Minefields are area denial weapons. This is why countries sign things like the Ottawa treaties, these landmine treaties, gets money put towards countries to not use them. Interestingly, one of these countries is actually Ukraine, but no one looks at that. Minefields are a terrible thing. I've heard that it's going to take 100 years to clear out the unexploded ordnance that Russia and Ukraine have been firing back and forth, and the minefields in Ukraine. Seaports like Mariupol or Bryansk are occupied, and large military facilities akin to Azovstal are destroyed. Demographically, the situation is even worse. Before the war, Ukraine already faced one of the worst population trends in Europe. The Institute for Demography estimates that only around 29 million people lived in government-controlled areas at the start of 2024. The war has accelerated the exodus of young Ukrainians, particularly women and children, leaving behind an aging population. Adding to this, hundreds of thousands of veterans will return home, many of whom will require physical and psychological support. Managing this social, economic and political burden without security guarantees would be a monumental task for any state forced to have the high military spending, let alone Ukraine. With a GDP per capita almost 5 times less than Greece. Additionally, without firm security guarantees and a concrete long-term plan, the likelihood of people returning from abroad remains slim. And this is what we have spoken about. Depending on how this war ends, when this war ends, gives us an idea of how many people may even want to return. A lot of people wanted to leave in the beginning. This is why I will say I think lengthening this war is in Russia's favour for the attritional protracted war, and that they don't need to win if Ukraine lose, if that then makes sense. I think it's in Russia's favour, personally, to extend the war. Now, there's a lot of arguments the other way, which I agree with too, that it may be in Ukraine and the West's favour, but having elections can be against that as well. And we go about this. Psychological support, this is something I see massively. The cost of war, the initial cost of war, losing guys, injured guys on the front line, is dwarfed by the cost of war psychologically afterwards, not only soldiers, civilians, all of this. And another massive one, which is not spoken about enough, and I speak to some friends about this, is asbestos. There is a shitload of asbestos in these areas. Of course, ammunition hits this building, it just turns into dust. That is going to be a huge problem down the line, and just getting rid of that as well. Lack of guarantees will multiply the factor of instability, with fears of another Russian invasion driving more citizens to flee once borders fully reopen. So if this isn't guaranteed, that it could happen again, those men that can't leave currently, they will then potentially leave. The resulting uncertainty would deter post-war investments, as high security risks and social instability would create an unattractive environment for any serious economic engagement. So why would you invest in here if this could then happen again? Now, an interesting part in this is the people might go, well, what country would take on these people as refugees? The West, Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe have a massive problem with replacement rate. That is somewhat being buffered by immigration. There's a lot of pushback on immigration. Potentially, this could be sort of the best of both worlds, taking on Ukrainians into here. And I've spoken to many people that say Germany, they're more than happy to take on a lot of Ukrainians as well. That's people that I've spoken to politically. Ukraine will also enter a period of uncertainty and risks. While Zelensky remains a unifying figure in wartime, internal tensions, which are often invisible to the Western audience, are mounting, creating an increasingly toxic political atmosphere. A stalled war, millions displaced, lost territories, and a crippled economy hardly set the stage for a calm and easy elections. At some point, Ukraine need to have elections. As Ukraine enters a period of intense political competition, accusations of military failures are likely to dominate the discourse. It will test Ukraine's ability to preserve national unity across political lines. Now, also, I think there is a risk of internal unrest, especially depending on how this war ends, particularly, I believe, with territory. Now, there are heavily armed, incredibly experienced groups within Ukraine with strong ideologies that have made incredible sacrifice themselves, their friends, on the promise by governments, not only the Ukrainian government, but also NATO. Could we see internal unrest there, depending how this war ends? I think that is a real possibility. Some argue that immigration could help address the problem. But what exactly would draw immigrants to Ukraine, where the average monthly salary is between $500 and $700 in a country ravaged by post-war problems and facing constant threat of another Russian invasion, especially when far more attractive opportunities are available within the EU? So that is immigration. But then we talk about, could you then take on an immigration refugees? Of course, they can be put in this area. Culturally, I believe this is going to have an effect and a problem as well. Many Western partners assure Ukraine that its aid will ensure that it won't happen. But how reliable are these statements, given the history of similar statements akin to will support Ukraine for as long as it takes? In today's realities, democracies operate on election cycles, and promises of long-term support can quickly become an object of shifting political winds. As elections approach, Ukraine could find itself the target of political bait. It is the main point of political debate, I believe, with opposition asking why the nation should prioritise foreign aid over expressing domestic issues like healthcare, education, economic problems, which we know are ravenous throughout the West, especially around economic problems, inflation, education, massive slipping behind there too. In such an environment, the commitment to Ukraine is unstable and can't be trusted. So election cycles, democracy, change, new party, that whole, as long as it takes, can be shifted right there. The same applies to military aid for Ukraine. While Russia will keep rebuilding its forces, Ukraine will primarily depend on its own much smaller domestic production and increasingly uncertain Western support, which will use peace as an excuse to diminish the aid. So West may see we need peace, we'll bring this down. Russia, despite facing similar challenges, holds a significant advantage by being larger in most metrics, allowing it to better absorb these problems. Its vast resources, particularly in oil and gas, offer economic leverage to soften the post-war problems. Moreover, Russia is likely to see some sanctions bypassed thanks to inconsistent enforcement. And we've also spoken post-war that there will likely be relations built then between the US and Russia again. And I think that has to be built purely to combat the massive rise of China, that there wants some amount of friendship across there. Under these conditions, it may only be a matter of time before Russia rebuilds a force large enough to deliver a decisive blow to Ukraine. Meanwhile, democratic Ukraine, without solid security guarantees, faces a far bleaker scenario. Current peace proposals essentially send the same messages. No guarantees for Ukraine, but a demand to cede territory and abandon aspirations of joining Western alliances. This is what Putin offered to Ukraine earlier this year. In other words, nearly 30 million people being asked to sacrifice because the West is too weak and unwilling to make the bold, risky decisions that could shape a better future. And there is some fear there of wider war spilling out and further problems, not just with aid, but the amount of conscription volunteers to actually be able to deliver more aid. But what is the realistic scenario in if a security guarantee then hinges on the return of all border areas back to 1991 border? How can that be done? They're not going to just withdraw. Therefore, how can that be done if you aren't willing to conscript hundreds of thousands, the West, to arm those hundreds of thousands? Steps into a huge problem. We often speak about how long this war may have to go. UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy has said, particularly as we approach the back end of 25 and 26 and the hardships of the war. So he's still speaking, at least from there, that there are potentially years to go, and that would not surprise me at all. Legends, I hope that you're having a great day. This might not line up because I'm going to put the end part at the beginning of how I filmed it, but have a great day. If you want to support me, there's links down below. But I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.